There is a question that sits at the center of this story, and it is not complicated, but it takes a while to answer. The question is simply this: why would a woman spend the coldest weeks of February dragging 12 ruined boxes through knee-deep snow to a ridge nobody else wanted, when every person who saw her do it told her, gently or otherwise, that she was wasting the last of herself on something already dead? That is the question. And the answer, when it finally comes not in words but in sound. By June, you could hear it from the road, a low, ceaseless hum that seemed to rise from the ridge itself, as though the hillside had learned to breathe. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The sound comes later. First comes the snow and the boxes, and the woman hauling them one by one through the cold because she had read something her grandfather had written in a composition notebook 40 years before she was born, and she believed it. Some things only look abandoned. That sentence was his. She had carried it in her coat pocket for the better part of a winter, written on a torn envelope in her own hand so she would not forget it. Some things only look abandoned. She did not talk about it much. She did not talk about most things much. Her name was Cora Pellerin, and she was 53 years old that February, and she lived on 4 acres of marginal land on a ridge in a county that had been losing people steadily for 30 years. She had been a high school biology teacher for 22 of those years before her knees made standing at a chalkboard impractical, and before the school itself consolidated with the one in the valley, and the teaching position simply ceased to exist. She had a dog named Pocket who was mostly healer and partly old, and she had her grandfather's notebook, and she had the ridge. What she did not have, according to everyone who cared to observe, was any realistic plan for what came next. The county extension agent, a brisk and collegial man named Dale Hauser, who drove a clean white pickup and wore his optimism like a vest, had visited her in January and spent 40 minutes explaining the various assistance programs available to small acreage landowners in economic transition. He had left a folder. The folder was thorough. Cora had thanked him and set the folder on the kitchen table where it remained, unread, serving primarily as a surface for her coffee mug. She was not being contrary. She already knew what she was going to do. She had known since October, when she had pulled her grandfather's notebook from a box in the back of the barn and read it twice in one sitting by flashlight because she could not find a lantern that worked. Her grandfather, Émile Pellerin, had kept bees on this same ridge for 31 years, from 1948 to 1979, when a combination of age and a bad winter took most of his colonies and took, shortly after, most of his remaining interest in the effort. He had written everything down, not in the organized fashion of a man who expected to be read, but in the dense, looping hand of a man who thought better with a pen moving, recording temperatures and forage bloom dates and the particular behavior of individual queens, with the same matter-of-fact attention he gave to rainfall and the names of the wildflowers that came up in the creek hollow each May. He had noted, in an entry dated March of 1962, that the ridge's south-facing slope retained warmth 3 to 4 weeks longer into autumn and emerged from cold 3 to 4 weeks earlier in spring than the valley floor, and that this differential was the single most important fact about keeping bees in this part of the county. He had underlined the sentence twice, which was the only emphasis he ever used in 3 decades of notes. He had also written, in a separate entry from 1971, a thought that was less practical and more difficult to categorize. "The bees do not belong to the keeper," he wrote. "They belong to the place. The keeper only convinces them the place is worth staying." Cora had read that sentence 4 times. She had not written it on an envelope. She did not need to. The 12 hive boxes had come from a man named Gerald Speer, who farmed a sizable operation in the valley below, and had acquired the hives as part of a property purchase 2 years earlier. Gerald had no interest in bees. He had arranged for a commercial beekeeper to assess them, and the beekeeper had told him, with professional efficiency, that the colonies were in poor condition, several were dead outright, and the equipment was old-fashioned and not worth transporting. Gerald had been on the verge of burning them when Cora had called him in late January. He had seemed genuinely puzzled by her interest, but had been perfectly willing to let her haul them away, and he had even offered the use of his flatbed trailer, which she accepted. She loaded the boxes herself with the help of a neighbor's teenage son named Marcus, who was 15, largely silent, and possessed of a physical capability that he seemed slightly embarrassed by. They had moved all 12 boxes to the base of the ridge road in a single long afternoon, and then Cora had spent the next 4 days moving them the rest of the way up, two at a time, on a sled she had built from salvaged lumber and a set of old ski runners her grandfather had nailed to the barn wall in 1967 and never taken down. The snow was mid-calf and the incline was real. Pocket walked beside her, unhelpful but present. Dale Hauser drove up on the third day. He parked his white pickup at the base of the ridge road and walked up far enough to see what she was doing and stood there for a moment with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man who is trying very hard to be supportive. He said he had heard she was working on some kind of beekeeping project. She said yes. He said the state apiarist was reporting widespread colony collapse pressure in the region and that a lot of experienced beekeepers were scaling back, not expanding, and that maybe this was not the best time to be taking on distressed equipment. She said she understood. He said he only mentioned it because there were grant programs for diversified small farm enterprises, but they generally required a viable business plan, and he was not sure bees in this condition would qualify. She said she would keep that in mind. He stood there another moment, then told her to stay warm and went back to his truck. She picked up the sled rope and kept pulling. Some things only look abandoned. The composition notebook also contained between its practical entries a kind of index of the ridge's forage calendar. Emil had catalogued, year by year, the precise sequence of bloom that the ridge offered. The willows along the creek hollow came first, sometimes as early as the last week of February, then the red maple at the woodlot edge, then the wild plum thickets on the eastern slope, then the black locust in June, which he had described as the great engine of the year, the bloom that fills the combs before the summer dearth. He had noted that the ridge had more black locust per acre than any comparable land in the valley, because locust grew freely in the marginal disturbed soil of the upper slope, and nobody had any reason to clear it. He had considered this the ridge's principal secret. 3 full pages were devoted to the locust bloom, its timing, its variability, its absolute dependability in certain soil and aspect conditions. He had written, "A beekeeper who controls a good locust ridge in this county will fill his supers in 3 weeks, or he will in none of the others." Cora had done rough arithmetic on the back of an envelope. If half the colonies she had recovered could be brought to full strength by June, and if the locust bloom held, the honey yield from a single good season could cover 2 years of modest expenses on the property. It was not a business plan in the sense Dale Hauser meant, but it was a plan. She moved the last 2 boxes to the ridge on a Saturday, and Marcus came up with her that day to help set them level on the rough cinder block bases she had already poured. He did not say much, as was his custom, but when they had finished, he stood back and looked at the row of 12 boxes on the south-facing slope, some of them weathered gray, some still showing the original white paint in patches, and he said, "They look pretty dead." She said, "Some of them are." He said, "How do you know which ones?" She said she would find out in March. He nodded and went back down the hill. Pocket sat in the snow next to the nearest box and looked at it with the focused, respectful attention he gave to things that interested him, which included holes in the ground, unusual smells, and apparently hive boxes. Cora stood on the ridge for a while after Marcus left. The valley below was gray and quiet, and the smoke from Gerald Spear's operation rose straight up in the cold air, and everything was ordinary and still. She could not hear anything from the boxes. In February, you rarely can. Dale Hauser was not the only one to make the drive up the ridge road that winter. Cora's closest neighbor by residence, a retired school teacher named Beverly Marsh, who had known Cora for 20 years and meant everything she said in the most genuinely caring way imaginable, came up in the 3rd week of February with a casserole dish covered in foil and a concerned expression she had been practicing since before Cora's retirement. Beverly sat at the kitchen table and talked for an hour about the wisdom of rest, the importance of allowing grief its proper space. The way that sometimes people coped with difficult transitions by throwing themselves into projects that were, at bottom, an expression of unprocessed feeling. She said she worried that Cora was taking on this bee business as a way of not sitting still long enough to feel things properly. She said the casserole was chicken and rice, and there was enough for 3 days. Cora thanked her for the casserole. Beverly meant it all well. That was, as Cora's grandfather might have noted in his looping hand, the difficulty. Gerald Spear himself came up once, on a day in early March when the temperature had climbed enough to be called mild by local standards, which meant it was above freezing before noon. He arrived unannounced, which was his style, and walked up the ridge road in the expensive boots he wore for outdoor occasions, and stood looking at the 12 boxes with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite amusement, but contained elements of both. He said he was glad she had gotten some use out of the equipment. He said the commercial beekeeper had told him those boxes were probably not worth the effort of salvaging. He said he hoped it worked out. He said it in the way that people say they hope things work out when they are quite certain the things will not work out and they want the record to show their goodwill. He asked if she needed any help with anything. She said she did not. He said the offer stood. Then he looked out over the valley in the way that men who own large portions of it sometimes look out over it, as though performing a quiet inventory, and he said, "You know there's about 1,000 acres of improved pasture between here and the highway, and most of those flowers are going to be sprayed before they bloom." She said she knew. He looked at the ridge above the boxes, at the slope of locust and scrub and wild plum thicket. He did not say anything about what he saw up there because he did not know what it meant. He said goodbye and went back down the hill. In the second week of March, Cora opened the boxes. She worked alone in the early morning, wearing her grandfather's old canvas jacket and the veil from a new suit she had ordered in January from a supply catalog. Her grandfather's notation about the south-facing warmth of the ridge having convinced her that inspection would be possible earlier here than the conventional calendar suggested. She moved systematically. She kept a clipboard. She used the same shorthand her grandfather had used in the notebook, because she had studied his entries long enough that his symbols felt native to her. Of the 12 colonies, 4 were dead. The losses were old, pre-winter, the hive beetles and wax moths having moved in some months before she had acquired the boxes, and there was nothing to be done about those except clean the equipment thoroughly, which she did. The remaining 8 colonies were alive. 3 were weak, borderline, requiring careful management and supplemental feeding to have any reasonable chance of surviving to the spring flow. 2 were moderate, in condition she would describe as salvageable with attention. 3 were, by any assessment, robust. They had wintered through the neglect of 2 years and the shock of transport, and they were still robust. She wrote the word in the notebook with a single underlining, the way her grandfather would have done, because she felt it warranted the emphasis. She told Marcus when he came up the following Saturday to help her clean the dead-out boxes. He had started coming regularly without being asked, which she had noticed without commenting on. She told him 8 were alive and 3 of those were genuinely strong. He said, "Huh." She said, "It's pretty good for what they came through." He said, "I looked up colony collapse." There was a pause. She said, "What did you think?" He said, "It seems like kind of a bad time to be doing this." She said, "Your grandfather ever tell you about locust honey?" He shook his head. She handed him the notebook, opened to the page with the 3-week estimate about the locust bloom. He read it standing there, holding it carefully, the way people hold old things. When he was done, he looked up the ridge at the locust trees on the slope, which in March were still bare and gray, and gave no indication of what they would be in June. He handed the notebook back. He picked up the brush he had been using to clean the bottom board of the nearest dead-out box and went back to work. He came up every Saturday after that. The feeding and management of the 8 surviving colonies through March and April was steady, daily work of the kind that does not look like much from the road. Cora mixed sugar syrup in the kitchen and carried it up in 2-gallon jugs. She checked the colonies every 3 days, watching the populations build, noting the queen activity on her clipboard in her grandfather's shorthand. She treated the weak ones with the patience of someone who has kept a classroom of uneven students for 20 years and knows that steady and specific attention, applied without pressure, is the thing that brings the slow ones up. By mid-April, all three of the borderline colonies had crossed into what she would call functional. By the first week of May, the 8 colonies had collectively produced enough brood and foraging population that she began to think about the honey supers she had ordered in March, the additional boxes that would be stacked on top of the strong hives when the bloom started, to give the bees room to store what they found. The locust trees on the ridge were in bud. Her grandfather had written that they bloomed in this particular hollow in the last 10 days of May most years, and earlier in a warm spring, and this spring was warm. She added the supers on May 18th. This was, according to the notebook, within the normal window. She allowed herself no more excitement than that. Gerald Spear's operation in the valley had 1,200 acres under cultivation that season, and Gerald had invested substantially in a new irrigation system and a contract with a regional produce distributor that required consistent, high-volume supply of specific crops, the kind of arrangement that rewards scale and punishes variability. Gerald's agronomist had prescribed a spray program in April and May designed to suppress the weed pressure in the established fields, and the spray program had been executed efficiently and professionally, as Gerald's things generally were. The wildflowers along the field margins went first, then the clover in the fence lines, then the wild mustard that had been yellow and visible from the ridge road in April, and that was now simply gone, replaced by the clean geometry of managed crop rows that were, from Gerald's perspective and from his agronomist's charts, exactly what they were supposed to be. From the ridge, Cora watched the valley go from patchy, wild color in April to uniform, ordered green in May. She did not say anything about it to anyone. It confirmed what her grandfather had written. The ridge was the thing. The ridge and the locust. The locust bloomed on May 23rd. It happened in the way that things happen on that hillside, quietly at first and then completely, the white raceme clusters opening along the upper slope in a progression that took about 4 days to reach full expression, and the smell of it came down to the lower slope and then to the road and was, as her grandfather had described it, and as she had never quite forgotten from childhood, unreasonably sweet. The bees knew before she did. She came up on the 23rd and heard the ridge before she reached the boxes, a sound that was already more than she had heard in March or April, a low, industrial purposefulness in the air above the hives that made Pocket stop and lift his head with his ears forward and his whole body attentive in the way that animals are attentive to things that are not exactly alarming but are very serious. Cora stood at the edge of the hive row and listened. She wrote a single word on her clipboard. Confirmed. The 6 weeks that followed were the densest in the notebook, her additions to her grandfather's record running 3 and 4 pages per week, detailed and specific in the way she had taught facts to students who needed facts to trust what they were learning. She extracted honey for the first time on June 29th. Marcus helped. They used a second-hand extractor she had purchased from a retiring beekeeper in the next county, driving 2 hours each way to collect it in March and fitting it into the trunk of her car with some ingenuity. The honey from the locust bloom is distinctive. It is pale and thin when fresh, and it crystallizes slowly, and it has a flavor that is floral and clean without being cloying, the kind of flavor that people who have tasted it once tend to describe with slight surprise as the best honey they have ever had. Cora ran the extractor and Marcus managed the frames, and Pocket sat in the corner of the barn in his habitual supervisory capacity, and by afternoon they had extracted 41 pounds from the 3 strongest hives alone. She had estimated 45 pounds from the 3, a conservative estimate from the notebook's historical averages. She looked at the number she had written in March and the number she had in the bucket, and she sat down on an upturned crate and was quiet for a while. Marcus did not interrupt her. He understood by now when the notebooks were being consulted internally. She had 2 more extraction sessions in July from the remaining colonies as the summer flow from wildflowers and linden continued along the ridge. The total honey yield for the season was 114 pounds across 8 colonies. The notebook from 1962 had recorded 120 pounds from 9 colonies in a comparable season, and Emile had considered that an average year. Cora wrote the numbers side by side in the margin. She did not underline anything. The numbers were enough. The summer dry period began in earnest in the second week of July, which was normal for this county, and which Cora had read about extensively in the notebook's later years. Her grandfather had written that the key to surviving the dearth was the colony's stored reserves going in, that a hive that had filled its brood combs with honey before the dearth arrived could idle through 6 or 8 weeks of low forage without distress, while a hive that had been worked hard and left thin would struggle and potentially requeen out of stress, an expensive disruption. Cora had left sufficient honey in the brood boxes during extraction, more than the standard guidance suggested, because the notebook had been specific about this, and she trusted the notebook over the standard guidance. The colonies idled through July in the way that full households idle through a slow month, calm and contained and waiting. Gerald Spear's summer was not idle. The irrigation contract had added costs that had been projected against a specific yield from the distributor relationship, and in June the distributor had renegotiated the per-pound rate downward by 12%, citing regional market softness, which was the kind of thing that large buyers do and small sellers accept. The irrigation system had also required an unanticipated repair in late June, involving a pump failure that cost 4 days of downtime on the most water-sensitive fields. Gerald was not a man who panicked, but he was, by July, a man who was recalculating things he had considered settled in January. He drove past the base of the Ridge Road on his way to town most mornings and did not look up at the ridge because he had no reason to. In August, Beverly Marsh came up again. She came without a casserole this time, which Cora noted as a change in the weather pattern of Beverly's concern. Beverly had heard, through the ordinary transmission of county information, that Cora had harvested a substantial amount of honey from the ridge. She asked Cora if this was true. Cora said it was. Beverly asked what she was going to do with it. Cora said she was going to sell it. Beverly said she thought that was wonderful, in the tone people use for things they find improbable but are willing to encourage. She said she supposed there was a market for local honey. Cora said there was. Beverly said she hoped it covered the costs of the equipment. Cora said it did more than that. Beverly looked at the row of hives visible from the kitchen window, 12 boxes on the south slope, white against the gray rock of the upper ridge, the locust trees behind them already back to their late summer quiet. Beverly said it was funny how things turned out sometimes. Cora agreed that it was. She had begun selling in early July before the season was finished because she had more inquiries than she had expected. A woman from the farmer's market in the county seat had come up to the ridge on a Saturday in June, having heard from Marcus's mother that there was honey from the locust ridge, and had tasted a sample spoon of the June extraction and looked at Cora with the uncomplicated sincerity of someone who has just tasted something they will not forget. She said, "How much do you have?" Cora said she did not know yet. The woman said, "How much will you sell me when you know?" They agreed on a price per pound that was higher than the standard market rate and lower than the woman would have paid to import a comparable product from out of state. Cora sold 60 pounds to the market vendor and kept the remainder for direct sales from the property, which she had listed in a small advertisement in the county weekly paper. Locust Ridge honey, available at the farm by appointment. She sold out of the remaining 54 pounds before the end of August. She had deposits for the following season by September. Dale Hauser came up in early September. He had not been up since February. He parked his white pickup at the base of the Ridge Road and walked up this time all the way, which Cora observed through the kitchen window and noted as significant. He knocked. She let him in. He sat at the kitchen table, which no longer had his folder on it, and he asked if he could ask how the season had gone. She said yes, and she told him the numbers. 8 colonies, 114 pounds, sold out at a premium price, deposits taken for next year. She showed him the notebook. He read the passage about the Locust Ridge, the one her grandfather had underlined twice in 1962. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I did not know about the locust." She said, "No." He said, "I should have asked." She said, "Yes." He sat with that for a moment, which cost him something, and she could see that it did. He asked if she would consider presenting at the County Extension Small Farm Workshop in October. She said she would consider it. He said he thought there were other people in the county with marginal ridgeland who were not aware of what it could support. He said it almost precisely the way a man who has spent a career being the person with the information says it when the information turns out to have been somewhere else, and to Cora's credit, she did not acknowledge the almost irony. She said she would bring the notebook. Gerald Spear came up in October. He called first, which was different from his previous visit. He arrived on a clear afternoon with the valley laid out below the ridge in the flat gold light of October, and the locust trees on the upper slope were bare again, their leaves down, and the hives had been prepared for winter with the same methods Emile Pellerin had recorded and Cora had followed precisely, the mouse guards fitted and the ventilation set for a cold season. Gerald stood outside the hive row for a while before coming to the door. She invited him in. He sat at the table and was quiet long enough that Cora simply waited him out, which was a skill she had developed over 22 years of allowing students to arrive at their own understanding. He said, "I'm thinking about the pollinators on my operation." He said the agronomist had flagged some yield depression in the east fields this season that might be related to inadequate pollination on the flowering crops, and that the spray program was likely a contributing factor, and that he was revisiting the program for next year. He said he had been wondering if there was a way to site some hives on the field margins, whether that was something that could work. He paused. He said, "I don't know anything about it." She said, "No." He said, "I know you do." He said it plainly and without elaboration, which was the closest he would come to saying the other thing, and they both understood that. She said she would talk to Marcus's mother about it, because Marcus had expressed interest in running a small operation of his own, and field margin hives might be a good place to start if Gerald was willing to modify the spray timing. Gerald said he was willing to modify the spray timing. It took him some visible effort to say it. She did not make it harder. The workshop at the Extension office happened on a Thursday in late October and was attended by 11 people, which was, Dale Hauser told her afterward, the largest turnout they had recorded for a small farm session in 6 years. Cora brought the notebook. She set it on the table at the front of the room and left it open to the page with the Locust Ridge entry, the one with the double underlining. She talked for 40 minutes about the south-facing aspect of ridgeland, about the forage calendar, about the discipline of leaving sufficient reserves in the brood box before the dearth. She talked about the difference between a colony that looks dead in February and a colony that is dead in February, and how you tell the difference and why it matters. She said, near the end, the thing that had been on the envelope in her coat pocket since winter. Some things only look abandoned. She did not explain it. A couple of people wrote it down. Marcus ran 4 hives on Gerald Spear's east field margin the following spring, starting in April, with splits from 2 of Cora's strongest colonies, which she provided at cost, plus the price of the new equipment he would need, which was her terms and not his ask. He was 16 by then and had been reading the notebook since March. He had started his own notebook, a composition notebook like Emile's, in which he recorded temperatures and bloom dates and the behavior of his queens in the same plain, specific hand that comes to people who take a thing seriously enough to write it down. He noted in his first May entry that the locust on the upper ridge bloomed on May 21st that year, 2 days earlier than the previous season, which he attributed to the warmer April. He underlined the date. Cora expanded to 14 colonies the following spring, adding 2 new packages from a reputable supplier to bring the operation up from the original 8 salvage survivors. The 2 dead-out boxes she had cleaned and refurbished through the winter served as the equipment for the new packages. The other 2 dead-out boxes she rebuilt and sold to a beginning beekeeper who had attended the extension workshop at a price that covered only her materials. The beginning beekeeper asked if she had any advice to start with. She said, "Find out what blooms and when and get there a little before it does." The beekeeper wrote that down too. By the third season, the ridge was known for the honey in a way that small places become known for things when the thing is genuinely good and the word travels at the pace of people mentioning it to other people in kitchens and at market tables. The county paper ran a short piece. A food writer from a regional magazine came up the ridge road in July and stood in front of the hives with her arms folded and her recorder going and asked Cora what made the honey distinctive. Cora said, "The locust." The writer asked what had made her decide to start with distressed equipment that everyone thought was beyond saving. Cora was quiet for a moment. She said, "I read something my grandfather wrote." The writer asked what it said. Cora said, "That the bees belong to the place. You convince them the place is worth staying." The writer used that as the final line of her piece. It ran in the magazine under a photograph of the ridge in June, the white boxes against the slope, the locust trees in full bloom behind them, everything pale and fragrant and loud with the work of insects that had been, not very long ago, 12 ruined boxes at the fence line of a man who had no use for them. The hum in that photograph is not something you can hear through a page. But if you have stood on that ridge in June, you know what it sounds like. Some things only look abandoned. That is the whole of it. That is the thing Emil wrote, and Cora kept, and Marcus wrote down again in his own notebook on the first page, before any dates or temperatures or queen notations, as though it were a rule that belonged at the front of things, the kind of rule that once you understand it, you cannot pretend you did not know it. Some things only look abandoned. The ridge has been humming ever since.